a esta persona.
Tonight I'm very excited to share with everybody this amazing town hall with this candidate here. So Blake, I'm gonna go ahead and bring you forward. I have known Blake since high school, and we used to hang out and just talk politics because we were just a bunch of robot nerds. And I'm very excited to see how much he has grown and all of the amazing work that he's done. And I am such a strong supporter of him for this campaign. And I am just over the moon to hear what he has to say tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Paloma, and thank you everyone who's attending here tonight. We are all impacted heavily by the housing crisis that we've been facing for quite some time. I know at this point you've probably been to 3 or 4 town halls on housing or affordability or some derivative thereof in the last few years alone. And I appreciate your willingness to come here tonight as we're going to really dig into what has kind of held us back as a county, what we can do in partnerships with our cities and as a county, and how we can work together to not just tackle housing, but affordability here. And to get started, I'm really excited to kind of introduce Jesus Guzman, who is our guest expert here for the town hall. I just want to say he is somebody who has done a lot of work in this county when it comes to housing production, and the issues that go around the finances when it comes to housing and affordable housing in Sonoma County. He's a policy expert. He's worked for many notable organizations here, and he does a lot of work when it comes to crunching numbers and working through the data to really get at the causes of these issues. So I'm really grateful to be here tonight. I'm really grateful for Jesus to be here tonight, and I'm excited for us to move forward. Now, with that in mind, Jesus, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Blake, first and foremost, thank you. It's an honor to be able to join you tonight. Good evening, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Jesus Guzman. I just briefly a little bit about myself. Actually, earlier today we're at Tole Lake. And I went with my dad there because he hadn't, when we first came to this country, we came in 1990. I was a little kid, and my dad worked at a little dairy farm in Petaluma on Lakeville Road. And he hadn't been back since that dairy farm had been sold in 1998. The farm was taken, I think, up to Siskiyou County. And it was a special day today to be able to go back and share with him, what had changed since then, right? Cardozo Pumpkin Patch, for those that remember, used to be sort of on the other side of that hill where the dairy farm that we grew up in. And it was really special to be able to go back, see the land, be able to see the conservation efforts that we have in place and how we're making land accessible for the public. And so I got to share that with him today. But I grew up in Sonoma. So after we left, grew up in Sonoma, and I've really spent much of my career working in the immigrant rights, labor rights, and equity field for much of my career. I've gotten a chance to spend some time working in housing as well, as Blake shared. And I'm excited to be able to share some of my experience and some of the work that we've been doing over the last few years on housing tonight. So Blake, again, thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for being here with us tonight. And just to get things started, wanted to ask you straight away, from your experience and the work that you're doing, what issues are you seeing around housing, access to housing in this county, and especially kind of production and growth of affordable and missing middle housing in this county?
Yeah, I think so. We often sort of talk about the housing crisis as sort of one as a crisis, and there's a lot of different crises. I think it's worth sort of disaggregating and looking at all the different ways in which people are experiencing it, because when we talk about a housing crisis and we sort of just lay that term out there, I think each one of us will sort of project onto it the ways in which housing has impacted us. And so each one of us has a different experience in the way housing has affected and impacted us, our families, our friends and relatives here in the community. And so I think it's worth just spending a little bit of time of sort of enumerating all the different ways in which folks are experiencing housing and the challenges that have really escalated in the last 10, 20 years in particular, and become even more acute. So one of those is obviously affordable housing in terms of, and just to be very specific, affordable housing crisis having to do with the type of housing that is subsidized, right, through local government, state governments, that is meant to support lower income families, right, that for whom market rate housing and other types of housing is out of reach, right? So with the proliferation of low wage work, that in so much of it, here in our county, having to do with tourism, for example, the service sector, with the amount of low wage jobs, housing is really out of reach for a lot of folks. Affordable housing and subsidized affordable housing is really important, but we have a tremendous challenge in terms of having an insufficient supply of affordable housing that is meant to support some of our lower income families that we have in Sonoma County. So we have, in one bucket, an affordable housing crisis, we have record number of folks who are unsheltered and unhoused, and that in and of itself is a challenge that has continued to escalate here in recent years. We have an issue around gentrification and displacement in our communities as well, in terms of folks who have grown up in neighborhoods, were raised in certain neighborhoods, have seen those neighborhoods change, and many families that are being displaced because of the pressure that many are seeing around home prices, rents continue to skyrocket, and the displacement that has continued to change the way that our neighborhoods look and who they're inclusive of, right? So affordable housing crisis, record homelessness, gentrification and displacement. Overall, and you mentioned missing middle, we have a general housing production problem in terms of not producing enough housing overall for everyone, but in particular, sort of that missing middle component. We have a lot of single family homes that we've built over the last half century, and some apartment buildings, but sort of everything in between that we sort of refer to as missing middle, duplexes, triplexes, townhomes, all these types of homes that tend to be a little bit more affordable. That's also a big missing gap there. We have super commutes. That's another huge challenge that's connected to housing, both for the folks who live here that commute out of the county to San Francisco or the Inner Bay area, or folks that live farther away, whether it's Mendocino or Lake County, that are commuting into Sonoma County, right? So we have these super commutes where, because there's an imbalance between jobs and housing throughout the entire Bay Area, really throughout California, we have these super commutes of folks who are on the road and have, they're contributing to, because of this imbalance, to greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, in terms of the vehicle miles traveled that we all have to for folks who have to commute. That's a real challenge. And then even just the jobs housing match within a community, right? Even if there isn't necessarily a commute that somebody is having to undertake outside of where they live, that fit between the types of jobs that we have in a community, the types of jobs we want to have in a community, and then the housing necessary to be able to match the jobs that we also have in that community. And then the last couple of notes I'll mention here as well is around fair housing and segregation. This is not an issue that I think for some we want to either tell ourselves the story as a country that somehow segregation was left back in the 60s, but that segregation is still very much alive and well in this country in terms of the patterns of segregation that we still see, most notably within housing, that our policies continue to exacerbate and make worse, right? And then as it related to that, but as an outgrowth of it as well, it's sort of the racial wealth gap that comes from it. Much of the way wealth is generated in this country for most Americans is around housing and home ownership. And we've seen the rates of home ownership in this country by race, when we disaggregate them, are ones that we see significant disparities. So just to share a statistic here for Sonoma County, home ownership rates in Sonoma County are about 67% of white households are homeowners, and about 35 and 39% of Black and Latino households are homeowners. And so we're talking that nearly double the rate of white homeowners white homeowners are nearly twice as likely to be, I'm sorry, white households are nearly twice as likely to be homeowners than Black and Latino households. And that is, when that is the primary vehicle in this country for wealth generation and intergenerational mobility, that is a huge challenge itself. And so all of these are different types of crises, right? They sort of exist within this umbrella of a housing crisis. And I think some of us may experience that as the rent is too high. We may think of it as, we're locked out of home ownership, or folks are experiencing bouts of being unsheltered. But all of these are different sort of expressions and manifestations of a housing crisis, but they don't necessarily all have the same cause, nor do they all necessarily have the same solution. And so hopefully what we'll get a chance to spend some time tonight is to be able to go through all of the ways in which they're connected, but the ways in which they're also independent, and the different types of solutions that we need to be able to put in place to address what for many of them are sort of distinct causes as well.
Thank you. And thank you for really digging into this, I think, critical component in all of this, which is we are really dealing with competing crises that have all been kind of branded as a housing crisis that we have to address and we have to work together on, some of which have been longstanding, some of which are newer, others which have been going back to literally the founding of the state. And we really have to start to bring these things together now if we're going to hope to make significant changes going forward. One thing I'd like to ask you a little bit about, from your perspective and from the experience that you've had, what role has the county played in helping to foster leadership on housing in the county with our cities? And if it hasn't, whether it's played a role or not, where do you think it should be?
Yeah, it's the county in particular plays a really important role in housing, in part because the county, by definition, the county is an extension of the state, and the county is going to be where much of, for example, state funding is going to come through. So whether it's community development block grants, a major source of funding known as CDBG, that type of funding that often is going to be the largest sum is going to come through the county. The county plays a really important role in then awarding funds, for example, to different projects across the county. So it just, by extension of being sort of a really important juncture for the state and the funding that comes through, cities are in a position where the county is going to be a really important variable, going to be really an important part of supporting cities to be able to achieve the different housing goals that they have. But also, just in terms of scale, the county has really a lot more housing expertise and staff in terms of, for example, the Community Development Commission that really offers a lot of technical assistance to cities. So the CDC, for example, is and it will continue to play a really important role in supporting cities, specifically smaller cities, right? Not every city necessarily has all of the same resources at their disposal. A city like Atati versus a city like Santa Rosa is going to have a different amount of staff available to be able to support certain projects, develop policies, implement regulations, to be able to advance projects, policies, to support these housing goals. So specifically for the smaller cities, the county is going to be one in which they're going to rely more heavily than a city like Santa Rosa that can be a little bit more independent because they can really staff up independently of that to be able to move those forward. So for a Gatati, for a Rona Park, even to some extent of Petaluma, a city, in terms of the staff and the departments there, the county is going to play an even more critical role. So for technical assistance, they're going to be really important for helping coordinate, right? Not just for a city that may be smaller, may rely and look towards the county to be able to provide technical assistance, but the leadership role is going to be really important, right? This is where being able to think about housing with a more holistic approach, thinking about how do the different cities support one another to approach an issue that doesn't just end at your city limits, right? Like housing is not something that for many of us, I've had this conversation recently with folks. We've been working on a different project around guaranteed basic income, and the funding with that, with the initial iteration of that project, it was a city allocation of funds. And when I was talking to families about this program, the conversation, at least when it was just for the city, was, well, you have to live within the city limits to be able to qualify. And for a lot of us, if you just live outside of the city limits by a little bit, that's an arbitrary line, right? And so these arbitrary lines that then dictate where funding goes one place or the other, who gets left out, who is included, they're ultimately arbitrary in a lot of ways because we as residents, this community, are not going to experience it necessarily the same way, right? And housing, in terms of where our job is located, if it's in Gatati versus I live in Petaluma, where that line is or isn't is ultimately arbitrary. And that's why it's up to our elected officials ultimately to work together, right, across the cities, across the entire county, to coordinate a coherent, coordinated response for a issue that's ultimately regional, that's ultimately statewide, right? It's to expect that Gatati alone or Rohnert Park alone is going to solve their issue of housing independently is missing the bigger picture, right? And that's why the county is ultimately going to be a really important leader, right, in being able to address these issues.
And just as a quick follow-up, because I completely agree with how you've laid this out. In your experience, though, what have we found from the county in the last few years? Is the county fulfilling that role, or are we running into a problem of a lack of expertise, brain drain, and other issues?
Yeah, I think you're alluding to some of the challenges that the county has faced. I think so. From my experience, it has, my impression of the county's actions over the last few years in response to housing has been that it's largely been reactionary. And so it hasn't had a lot of long-term planning in terms of how we're going to approach these issues. It has been largely reactionary in the sense of one crisis after another. And so when we're responding to crisis, there is absolutely a need to have some type of rapid response when there's a disaster that happens, or there's an emergency, there's something that feels urgent, but we're missing the bigger picture because in housing in particular, the timeline in which we're operating is much longer, right? So especially when we're thinking about when we have to approach the housing crisis by thinking about the individual different types of housing crises that we sort of laid out earlier, right? When we delineated 8 or 9 different types of crises, each one has its own timeline. And those timelines, if we're going to be effective in responding to those, we need to be able to have long-term planning, have some patience, and be able to coordinate across the board. And from my experience, at least looking at what's been going on for the last few years, it has been largely reactionary. And if that is going to be the standard approach, we're not going to get very far in terms of this type of problem that requires us to have much more long-term patience, vision, and planning.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you, and specifically, like, I just really want to thank you, Jesus, for sharing, your perspective on what needs to change in terms of housing in Sonoma County. It's really just such an important issue that I think everybody feels really deeply in the county and throughout the Bay Area. It's a really, really challenging topic. And I just want to encourage everybody in the chat to please go ahead and ask any questions that you have of both Jesus and Blake. Please go ahead and either use the Q&A function or post your questions directly into the chat. We'll try to get to as many as we can in the time that we have. And I really want to start, Blake. I really, we've talked a lot about housing. You know that this is a huge issue in my heart as well. I really want to hear, what is your vision for addressing housing in Sonoma County?
Thank you very much. And honestly, a lot of where my vision arises really comes from the problems that Jesus laid out. The county can play a fundamental role when it comes to coordinating housing and really our housing goals for the next 10 years. The problem, however, is that for that to happen, a few things need to be in place that we just frankly don't have. For one thing, and this has been especially true in South County, cities need to be able to trust that they can work with the county. We have had a history, unfortunately, of the county showing up last minute, wanting to have certain things happen, not giving cities enough time, and being, frankly, demanding changes rather than working with them. Not every city has the same housing problem. Not every city can support the same type of housing. And so if we are going to address this on a regional level, we are going to have trust. Part of building out that trust means being able to provide a lot of the technical assistance and the financial assistance that Jesus spoke about earlier. Right now, our CDC, our housing authority, they really don't have the technical staff to meet the demand. They haven't really been able to play a leadership role in quite some time. And part of that is because they have had a bit of a brain drain over the last few years. Housing was rearranged underneath our health department, which doesn't make any sense. We've had merging and consolidation of structures that will frankly harm us unless we are understanding that housing going forward and the role that the county plays really has to be prioritized given the staffing and the resources. We've lost some of our best people to the state and to nonprofits already, and it really hampers our ability to plan for the future. So part of that means being able to work together with cities to talk about housing elements, make sure that the county's housing element is in alignment with the new housing elements that every city's working on right now. Being able to talk about long-term goals and what kind of financial grants that the county could be looking for to help some of our cities with their long-term planning. Being able to help with smaller cities that might want to do a lot of what Runner Park has done, for example, with area-specific plans and providing those technical resources. I know in Petaluma, for example, we have an entirely contracted planning staff. We seem like a larger city, but in reality, our budget doesn't allow us to have that large of a department really beyond the contracted planners we have, which means having county technical assistance could be huge for our long-term benefits. Beyond kind of restabilizing the county's resources and support, which are both financial and technical, it's then going to take a little bit of time to provide that without an expectation. This can't be the county dictating what cities are doing, but working with cities towards a common goal. Because most of us want to see more density in our urban core. Most of us want to see more housing around transit corridors. Well, the only way we can do that is if cities and the county are working together, and that will require a new relationship we haven't had in quite some time. Outside of that, we are going to have to really start to work, once we've kind of established trust, work with our cities to build out a long-term roadmap. Now, in the past, and this was done by who I hope will be my predecessor, there have been efforts to create compacts on a regional level that would create kind of this regional strategy and approach to getting to our goals. The problem is it never conferred with cities to give them a chance to really engage in Sonoma County, to really have a say in that process. And it skipped the fact that Sonoma County doesn't even do that right now, and it didn't back then. What I want to see us do at the county level is really partner with our cities for these long-term goals and for the timelines that match. That way we are not asking too much, and we're also getting the most innovative solutions we can from every part of our community. Beyond that, this is where our general plan really comes up. So right now, most cities are in a general plan process. They're going through and updating their housing elements. They have to deal with new housing numbers that have been prescribed by the state. And on top of that, they're looking to see how they want to develop their cities going forward, what they want the next 20 to 30 years of development to look like. Well, the same is true for the county, except we've been kicking this can down the road for years now, and we're trying to hurry up right now and catch up. The reality is we need to go through a brand new engagement process. We need to really bring people in to participate, to understand the value of it, because the outcome of this plan will dictate what our zoning map looks like, what our zoning code looks like, and what a lot of our decisions will be for development for the next 30 years. And that should be a process that engages most of us, where the county is going forward to communities, but especially rural communities, but also working in partnership with the processes our cities are going through right now, so that our housing elements and our general plan are not at cross purposes. And finally, by going through this process aggressively, we can adopt our own climate mitigation plan, much like the city of Petaluma has done, much like Runner Park is doing, to really be able to make sure that we're meeting our climate goals. Because the other thing about housing in this county is that we're never going to be able to strictly build our way out. But there's a difference between giving up and getting closer. And by going through this process now, by building up the partnerships we've lost, by really laying out a strong general plan that has brought in enough community input, that's really working in partnership with our cities, we'll be able to, in the next 5 to 8 years, set up, frankly, the regulatory structure we need so that development moves forward quickly, but in the places where we want it to go. Because we don't have to sacrifice our green belts, our green spaces. We don't have to see sprawl. We can do it with the land that we have, especially in the urban corridors. The only way for us to protect that and to avoid having an overcorrection down the road is for us to do that hard work now. And it's been something that we've avoided for far too long at the county. And finally, one thing I just want to say, there are a lot of candidates who will promise, well, you just do this and you'll fix housing in a few years, everyone will have a home. We know that's not feasible here. The reality is we need to do the work now to fight so that people can hang on, because we are going to have to, on one hand, fix a regulatory structure and relationships that have been defunct for quite some time, and at the same time, work to increase intervention so we can stabilize those communities that are most vulnerable, which includes most of us at this point. Most people in this county are a paycheck away from being homeless. We don't like to think about it. We don't like to acknowledge it. But the reality is the scale of people who need help has only grown. So that means while we're doing all of this, we have to start looking at greater interventions, especially when it comes to things like housing trusts, land trusts, and really taking some of our older housing stock off the market so we're able to really protect those folks who live there and really start to make sure that people here can start to build generational wealth. And one comment I do want to flag, because it's something that Jesus brought up through several comments throughout his presentation, which is we do have a problem when it comes to making it possible for people of color in this county to buy a home. We have historic segregation issues that have been well established through several reports in the last few years and in the last year. And if we are going to start to address this while we're addressing our housing crisis, we have to make sure those two things are intertwined, because what we don't want to see happen is that we resolve this crisis for only one group of people. And the only way to do that is if we really start to address where we're having gaps in our zoning, who we're appointing to these boards, how these policies are impacting different groups of our community across the county and in South County. Because if you've checked out the census recently, the county is changing and we need to embrace that. And we need to be able to work to make sure that that change is supported and not put in a position where you have people living together in cramped conditions, which, as someone who has now knocked on well over 4,000 doors at this point, I can tell you a good chunk of this district are living in cramped conditions. We have to make these changes together. And I think there's a huge opportunity for us to do it. It just requires a supervisor who sees that as a vision that has to be dictated to staff, dictated for our general plan process, and who's willing to rebuild those partnerships with our community leaders. It's why I'm endorsed by so many city leaders right now in this district and outside of the district. I think I'll stop here because my answers tend to go very long. Thank you.
Thanks, Blake. I mean, it was wonderfully comprehensive, and I really appreciate that. And we are getting questions coming in from the chat, so I want to make sure we have time to get through some of those. And Jesus, please feel free to comment as you find some, you have things to add in as well. The first question came in from Susan Kirks, and I wanted to ask you this question, Blake. What is your, and actually this kind of relates to a lot of your discussion around the general plan as well. What's your position on commercial cannabis in residential areas? So would love to hear your thoughts on that.
So in terms of, I'll say commercial cannabis for the county and in terms of a county general plan. So right now there's a fight over where grows should be in the county. And part of that is because they haven't updated their general plan or their zoning map. And their zoning map's inaccurate. So even places that are actually agricultural aren't even flagging that way. I do believe cannabis is an agricultural product. I know that's a bit of a fight here, but it's frankly the truth, and it's a growing product being produced in this county. I want to see us go through general plan revision so that as a community, we're able to actually identify where these grows should go. And whether that's residential or with setbacks or in specific parts of the county, I want us to go through that process together so that on one hand, we're not destroying an industry that could really bring a lot of support and growth for this county. And at the same time, we're taking input from people who may have to live nearby. We can find that middle ground, but I want to see that reflected in our new general plan update. I know that might feel like a bit of a non-answer, but part of why I'm framing it that way is because lately what we've seen are elected officials who will take either a hard stance or no stance and skip the community part, or skip the part of actually talking to both residents and growers and actually looking at the long term. If we update our plan, update our zoning map, we don't have to have these disagreements anymore, or at least they'll be far more infrequent.
Thanks very much, Blake. And then there's a lot of really great questions coming in, and honestly, I'm really interested in Sheila's question here. Can transit keep up with this housing growth? As we want to add more housing, as we want to bring in more people into this county, how can our currently kind of stressed transit system take on that increase?
So I'm glad you've brought up transit, because frankly, that's going to be critical for how we deal with the expansion of housing in a way that's actually not detrimental to the environment. So earlier I mentioned development around transit-oriented corridors. The reality is right now we have the tools we need, but none of them communicate. So we have Golden Gate Transit, we have SMART, we have Sonoma County Transit, we have Petaluma Transit, Santa Rosa Transit, and then we have, our existing bike paths and pedestrian access points in cities and in the county. The reality is these things would work very well if they actually communicated together. And for anybody who is a transit nerd in the audience who's going, but there's a blue ribbon commission. There is a blue ribbon commission, and it's going to create shared branding, and that is lovely, but it's not the part that matters. The part that matters is the routing. The part that matters is being willing to have these disparate components work together as part of one whole, so that transit actually or public transit actually becomes a preferable alternative for people. You'll see it a lot in Petaluma. You'll see it a lot in other cities. People will say like, well, it's the last mile issue. Yes, that's part of it. We can talk about making sure it's easier to access by bike. We can talk about electric bikes. We can talk about other components of that. But the reality is without these pieces working together, we're always going to feel a bit defunct. That's why as supervisor, what I would like to do is really focus on making sure that we, for one thing, prioritize expanding SMART to Cloverdale, where they've already built a train station and where it was promised to go in the first place. There was an opportunity to do this not too long ago, to put it on the 5-year project list for the Metropolitan Transit Commission, which would have given it state and federal funding to pull this off. Our current supervisor fought against it. I don't know why. But as a result, this will take much longer. I would want to work to not only extend this out to SMART, but then forge a connection that Caltrans has already offered to connect the Capital Corridor to SMART. The advantage of this is that we would then have a whole new route of traffic that was currently going to 37, taken off the road, expanding out our fares, expanding out our service capacity, and allowing SMART in turn to offer fares at a lower rate and more off and a route that's actually conducive to people. I don't know if you saw on social media today, Smart had this thing where they're like, ridership is up. Is it gas? Is it that we made it cheaper? Well, they haven't made fares cheaper long enough for that to have an impact. Of course, it's the gas prices. But the reality is we cannot expect hyperinflation to be the tool that we use in order to bring people to public transit. That's just madness. So in order to really address this, we have to do what every other transit network has done, which is you run at a bit of a deficit, you increase the number of routes than you can afford, you run at a lower fare price than you can afford, then you build in trust, because with public transit, it's all about trust. Trust in the routes, trust in the times, and trust in the cost. Once we bring those prices down and increase the rider schedule, we can then connect our disparate transit networks in a much better way. Because now we can connect people to commute hubs. Now we can connect people to tourism. Now we can talk about maybe expanding out Sonoma County Transit into Runner Park, or expand it out further into Cotati, so that there's greater use. These are all ways that if we're able to pull off, will help support housing. And I would like to make one final point here, which is a lot of state and federal dollars right now, whether it's for road repair, whether it's for housing, whether it's for general infrastructure, if you can tie it to a transit project, you have a much bigger opportunity for funding. It's something we leave on the table constantly. I also want to give an opportunity for Jesus to weigh in, because I just went on a whole rant there.
No, that's great. I mean, it's brilliant. I agree. All of those are really good points. And I guess just to compliment and build off of what you're sharing, I think there's also a bit of there's a shift that sort of has to happen in terms of our own sort of thinking about the way we think about the physical sort of design of our communities. And that's in much of the way our communities right now look. And I've lived in Sonoma County nearly my entire life. I love Sonoma County, but I do not love how dependent I am on my vehicle to be able to get around Sonoma County. There are very few options otherwise in terms of being able to walk to get my groceries, or to be able to ride a bike safely without having to compete with large vehicles to try to get across a street, or just riding down a corridor. And it can be really challenging. So the way that we've designed our communities is not conducive to anything but a vehicle. And that's where we have to start thinking differently about the way we design our community, the type of housing that's necessary to be able to create more walkable communities, more bikeable communities, that I think a lot of us in some way are intrigued by, but the shift from where we're currently at to getting to that point is sort of the scary part, because there's a risk of sort of making that shift and redesigning what our neighborhoods look like. But we know that we're compelled to do that in large part because of what climate change is really calling us to think about, which is that in the state, in terms of some of the policies around the way they even score housing, and the types of regulations around a project that's proposed, we have to analyze these by the amount of vehicle miles traveled for each project. And that's the state saying, hey, look, when you propose a housing project in a community, one of the first things you're going to have to look at is where is it located and how many vehicle miles travels is that going to produce? Is it more? Is it less? If it's fewer, that's better, right? And that likely means it's near transit, it's near a lot of amenities. We like that. That's going to be good generally for the environment. And if it's far away, that's antithetical to the goals of trying to prevent sprawl, right? We want to try to create more walkable communities. So there's some mechanisms in place right now, right, to try to nudge us in that direction, try to move us in that direction. But there really has to be a full sprint sort of in that direction to create that, right? And that, I think, requires a shift and sort of thinking about the kinds of neighborhoods that we're envisioning. And it's not necessarily the sort of white picket fence single family home that takes up a lot more space. With the limits that we have to sort of rethink what that looks like. And that means that, these are likely communities where we have more neighbors. And that's, I think, ultimately a really positive thing, where we're able to walk to the corner store, where we have more bike lanes, and the type of transit that, even though the train is a very sexy sort of type of mode of transportation that I'm often intrigued by, and I very, very much enjoy, it's ultimately the unsung hero of the bus that I think most folks ultimately rely on. And the bus is something that is often one of the first things being slashed in terms of the funding that's necessary to make that happen, but that most low-income families depend on. And we need more frequent stops, we need more stops, we need more routes to be able to make that a viable option for more folks to be able to take advantage of that, and then connect that network to the rest of the options that are available. You were talking about sort of that last mile. There's a lot of new types of products around micromobility that are able to try to help us with that last bit. But all of this is going to require, I think, to your point earlier, Blake, a much more regional approach to how we're thinking about how these networks of transportation work and complement and reinforce each other, right? This isn't going to be something that each city is going to be able to address individually. It's going to require all of them coming together, and that's where the county plays, again, a really important role.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. These are such great answers, and I appreciate both of you being so comprehensive in talking about your views on how transit and housing kind of come together and work together. I want to make sure we get to another question because there's just so many good ones coming in. The next question I'm gonna direct to both of you. What is a good approach to housing in terms of, and this was asked by Jerry in the chat. What's an approach to folks who are homeless, and what are your thoughts on the Vanucci lawsuit?
Oh, sorry, which lawsuit?
Vanucci? I don't know if I'm saying
thank
that right.
In terms of an approach for folks who are homeless, I think, and I'm going to try and be a little more brief this time. I think this is really where our expansion of transitionary housing is going to be critical. We have very successful models of this in the county. The problem is they're mostly in one district. We need to expand out transitionary housing services with wraparound services in every district. We also need to move away from the feudal approach we have to addressing homelessness. So just to be real brief, right now how this works, supervisors fight for money for their providers in their districts usually. There's also the continuum of care, which helps distribute funding to different providers and programs throughout the county. The problem is it's a little bit of a feudal approach. A lot of it depends on which cities have better representation, which districts are fighting more. What I would like to see is what a lot of other counties in the Bay Area have done. And it's not to say that anybody's perfect, it's just to say it's a little more standardized. You're taking a whole person approach to how you respond to homelessness. You intake them in a coordinated point, which I recognize, by the way, that the county has talked about updating to coordinated entry. It's not quite what we actually have now. Have actual coordinated entry to immediately work through what programs people are able to qualify for, whether it's state, federal, county, local, what have you, then start to determine, is this somebody who has deeper needs? Is this somebody who has a mental health issue, an addiction issue, some specific emotional trauma that they're having to work with, or somebody who had bad luck or had circumstances that if you put them back into the right conditions, they're likely to move forward. Once you've assessed those people out, you then start to shift to where folks should go. The reality is with our homeless population, every point in time count tells us the same thing. These folks are mostly our community members. They're not from far away. Heck, they're not even from another city. They're from usually the city they're in where you meet them. And it's time for us to start treating these folks as the actual community members they are. And part of that means having a rapid process for intake, having a distribution process that gets people to the program they need or the support they need, or to the rapid rehousing program they need. One fundamental problem with all of this, of course, is that let's say that person is ready to go straight back to housing. You get them, maybe there's some career training, maybe there's other skills that need to be afforded to be able to get them in a good place. Or you've got somebody who's gone through transitional housing and now they're ready to go into permanent housing. It's the permanent housing part that creates a problem because we have so few units of housing stock that is affordable in this county. The other issue too is even if you provide HUD vouchers, I can tell you as a caseworker, for one thing, there's a waiting list a mile long to get your voucher. The other thing is that usually they do not match the cost of rent here. And a lot of folks just won't take the voucher. So if we're going to do this, we are really going to have to leverage some state funding to create these kind of long-term housing locations for folks who are just getting back on their feet and moving straight back into housing. We've done a lot of this as a county, or at least as cities. through housing is key through the state. This is when they reclaim hotels and other facilities to be able to turn into housing. One interesting thing to note in this district, Rohnert Park did a huge grant. They did not get any help from their supervisor, even though they should have. They had to largely go alone. With Petaluma, there was credit taken, but a lot of that work was done after it was already approved. Our cities are going after these funds on their own, and they really should have a supervisor to help get them there. So when it comes to homeless response, just in brief, we really need to create coordinated entry that goes for a whole person approach that doesn't shove them around the county, but actually addresses the needs they're going to have long term and works through a plan to get them rehoused. And I will end my circle there. No, Jesus, if you've got anything to add.
It's hard to follow. That's very comprehensive. I agree. I think that's really well said. The piece around permanent supportive housing in particular is really interesting, and it's a really good point about the lack of distribution across the county in terms of seeing some of that sort of in with talking to folks in North County and the need for transitional housing there. There's a lot of it is concentrated in sort of central Sonoma County. So having that better distribution of these services and housing across the county. But I was thinking about permanent supportive housing in particular because I think we tend to rely, I mean, for the production of affordable housing on affordable housing developers, right? Like the cities and the county rely on affordable housing developers through the provision of subsidies to build housing. Now, affordable housing is different than permanent supportive housing itself, right? And so for many folks, there's still a need to be able to have the types of partnerships that are necessary in place for somebody who may be an affordable housing developer, but they're looking to build a permanent supportive housing, which is very distinct, has its own challenges and needs to be able to be effective in that. And again, something that the county can play an important role is in bringing all the partners together to be able to make that successful. So we see some of these examples in the county right now, but we really need to sort of build up that institutional knowledge, both within the county and also with our affordable housing developer partners and all of the service providers that also are working in that field to be able to grow the amount of permanent supportive housing that's ultimately needed to be able to address this issue and sort of develop that expertise.
Thank you so much. I am really pleased with those answers. I think that it's really great to see the thought that both of you have put into this really important issue. And another incredibly important issue that we have in California in nearly everything points back to water. And Earl brought this up in the chat, and I want to make sure we have time to ask it. And they state that with all this new housing, like, it's great, we're going to add so much housing, we're going to get all these people into, like, equitable living spaces. Do we have enough water? Like, there's all of these houses being built now, there's hotels, there's all of these things currently being built. How are we going to support the people who live here now and an expanding population with the limited water resources we have?
I am glad you asked that question, because this comes up quite frequently. If we're going to develop, and we're going to develop in a way that is remotely sustainable, that we are going to really have to focus on city-centered growth. The reason we need to do this is because cities have the infrastructure to better retain the water that is expelled. I bring this up because the next step in this is to have the county, and this will be a long-term investment and it will take time, but we'll have just enough time to start to pull this off. The county will need to start investing in tertiary water treatment to help cities clean their water from exit to tap. Orange County does this already. It is something that maybe 20 years ago people didn't want to think about, but the water is clean. You don't have to think about where it might have come from. The reality is we have to get to a point where we're reusing every bit of water that we either consume or that we expel outside. And there's a lot of ways to do that in partnership with our cities, as long as we can give them the reuse infrastructure needed to make that possible. This is also another area where not only updating the county general plan, but also working in coordination with our cities is so important. Because I can tell you as a planning commissioner in Petaluma, there are water conservation regulations that don't even kick in unless the drought is at a certain severity. Well, the reality is for the next 20 years, every regional assessment has told us that we can expect more drought, not less, that conditions, frankly, conditions where we don't have drought are going to be rare. After 20 years, most models look terrifying. So if we're going to do the work we need to do and support the growth that we can expect, this is where updating our regulations for maximum conservation, especially for new developments, are going to be so important. And finally, in the long run, this is where county investing in storage, county protecting water transfer so that we have good groundwater reserves so that our aquifers aren't tapped. This is where county really investing in long-term protection of our water is going to be so important, because we are going to need reserves during the rough times. And if we can work together with our cities and we can update our code for the future, and we can provide the kind of support service they need in terms of water treatment, we can do a lot. I'm not going to say that this will make all growth possible, but it'll at the very least make a lot of the growth that we can expect much more sustainable. And I'll turn it over to Jesus.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add is that I think it's important to keep in mind that our older housing stock is far more water inefficient than our new housing stock, right? Like our older housing, we weren't really thinking about these issues. We were actually quite reckless with the way we managed water and didn't really think about it very much in terms of, and much of our housing stock is aging. It was built during 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and our new housing, right, has in part has a lot more in terms of the building codes and standards that are required, but it's with a lot more thought in mind around how to make it more water efficient, creating electric homes that are going to be much more sustainable. On top of the fact that I think the types of homes that are going to be of much more modest or higher density are also not going to include things like large lawns. And lawns, for example, is a misallocation if we're thinking about if the comparison is between potable water and what we're using to water our lawns, I think we can all agree that having potable water is going to be the priority. So if that's the sort of the juxtaposition and contrast we're making, then there is going to be a sort of reallocation that has to happen. Newer housing is going to be more water efficient, is going to be if there's landscape much more drought tolerant, right? As we sort of enter this new age of being much more mindful of how we use our water. So in some regards, we have to retrofit and our old housing stock to be more water efficient, conserve more water, and our current older housing stock isn't doing that, right? So just by building newer housing, we're going to be on the margins, improving on the efficiency of the existing water supply that we have.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. These are such good answers, and we have had so many amazing. I just want to thank the people in the chat and in the Q&A sections. We've had so many amazing questions, and unfortunately, we're running out of time to be able to answer them. But we are going to hopefully be able to reach out to some of you directly to be able to get an answer to you after this webinar. So if you asked a question, we will do our best to get back to you on an answer. I want to thank you, Jesus, so much. I really appreciate what you were saying. It speaks so true. And I really appreciate your perspective on this. And Blake, as always, I really always love hearing you talk and, hearing the depth of information that you have on all of these answers. It's really great to just learn so much from you talking about all of this. I want to ask something of you, Blake, which is just going to be such a hard question for you to answer. How can people support your campaign if they really liked your answers and they want to get behind you? What can people do to help make sure that you are the person solving these questions in June?
Thank you. Just to be quick, right now we are having canvases. We're going out knocking on doors every weekend. We're also letting folks go out on their own in their own neighborhoods. That's an option too. We are text banking. We are getting up our phone banking. We are going to be postcarding soon. And we are also reaching out to folks more specifically in their community. So if you've got areas that you think we need to address, just reach out in terms of location. A lot of this information can be found on my website, on our social media. I cannot express enough how helpful the volunteer support will be. We are doing remarkably well going into this campaign, but we're in the crunch period now and we have a lot more people to reach. Our message is working, our engagement is working, and we are being endorsed heavily by a lot of critical people in this community. We just need the volunteer help to reach everyone. So I recognize knocking on doors might not be your thing. Phone banking is fine. If that's not your thing, text banking is fine. If you want to write postcards that we're sending out to the community, that is great too. We also, and I'm going to turn my head, we have yard signs. If you would like a yard sign, please reach out to us online, reach out to one of my coordinators, Aaron. We are putting them up as we speak. We started putting them up in neighborhoods before David got spooked, and then he way overreacted to get up his larger signs. We will have our 4x3s in the next, I think it's in the next week, assuming the printer gets it on time. And so we'll be putting up our larger signs as well. So if you've got good locations that you think a larger sign should go out to, please tell us. We're mapping that out now, and we could use the help to make sure that people see that there's 2 candidates out there right now. Signs don't win elections, but they do help people pay attention. And outside of that, just please reach out to your networks. Talk to your friends, remind people of the importance of this election. The reality is most people in this county don't know who their supervisor is. And I know that because we've been knocking on doors since last August. And the most common response that I get at the door is, what is a supervisor? So it's going to be really important that folks reach out and help elevate the importance of this election, because whoever is in that seat come June, and this election, by the way, is in June, will dictate what a lot of development looks like, what a lot of the future in the county looks like for the next 20 to 30 years with this general plan process. So I appreciate your help and I appreciate your support.
And specifically, I know that this is always the difficult thing with campaigns, but you need money to make these things happen. Blake, how can people donate to your campaign?
If you go online, there is a lovely link on our website where you can donate either by paying by card online right now, or you can submit a check, and there's a form you can download to do that as well to send in the mail. We do appreciate all contributions as we're going into this crunch period.
Thank you so much. And Blake, do you have any final words for our lovely audience about something maybe that gives you a lot of hope in the South Sonoma County?
The thing that gives me a lot of hope are frankly the people that we meet at the door. I have now spoken to probably more people than I've met in my entire lifetime at this point in terms of Canvas. And I've run into people who are struggling almost the entire way through, but I've yet to meet anybody who's given up. A lot of people here right now, whether they're like 4th or 5th generation Petalumen, or they just moved in a few years ago, or they're somewhere in between. A lot of us are struggling, but what I found consistently at the door is that this district, this community, wants to work together to start to solve these problems. They're not looking to blame. They're not looking to just be angry. They're looking to come to solutions. And I'm really hoping that this campaign can represent that and be a good conduit to us moving forward, because I think a lot of us are tired of the same problems being relitigated every few years with very little movement. It's time we actually had leadership that was proactive and wanted to work with everyone here. And I have found at the door that people are ready to work. They're ready to roll up their sleeves, and they have been working. They're tired, but they want to see a better life for their family, and they don't want to be kicked out. And I know we can work together to do that. And I'm really grateful for everyone who's here and who has sat through my very circular answers.
I appreciate that. And speaking of the people of South Sonoma County, I want to ask the people in the chat. I really appreciate all of your time. I'd love to hear what gives you hope. And Jesus, I would also love to hear what gives you hope in South Sonoma County.
Do you want me to go to or are we doing the chat? Sorry.
Oh, I want to hear from you while they're typing in the chat. I want to hear what gives you hope.
Well, I think Blake and his candidacy. I think this is what's really exciting about the moment that we're in and this conversation that we just had. I think everyone just heard Blake walk us through a lot of the time that he's put into the different approaches, the policies, and that's really based on all the conversations that he's been having. What now sounds like thousands of conversations that Blake has had with folks in the community. And it's that approach ultimately that's going to be grounded in a place that's going to be compassionate, that's going to be really thoughtful. And that's ultimately what gives me a lot of hope in terms of having the caliber and quality of an elected official soon to be from Blake that we really need in this county.
I couldn't agree more. Love you very much, Blake. And I'm so thankful. Thank you so much again, everybody, for joining us. I really appreciate having you all here. And I'm so excited to read through all of the wonderful messages in chat. And thank you so much, Jesus and Blake, for sharing your thoughts with us this evening. I'm very thankful that we have wonderful, bright minds like you helping to lead the charge on solving these incredibly difficult issues.
Thank you for being an amazing moderator, Paloma.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Paloma.
All right. Good night, everybody.